Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, ERM Implementation, a Primer to a Five-Step Process. My name is Jeff Rigsby. I'm the President and CEO of CB Resource, and I will be presenting today's session. First, I would like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. As a matter of fact, I'm impressed that you would do this as we are in the midst of the holiday season. We did mention in our invitation that this was a 30-minute session, and we're committed to keeping to that schedule. Just going to close that. Okay. For those of you who may not be familiar with CB Resource, we are a professional service firm located in Irvine, California. We do three things. We do enterprise risk management, capital planning, and strategic planning, and we specialize in ensuring that our community bank clients' performance and risk management priorities are in sync. We currently serve community banks in over 40 states. So, quick word. You're not seeing my screen. Okay, I'm just hearing that nobody's seeing my screen. So, I do believe that has been remedied. My apologies. You good? It's good to have a team. Okay, before we get started, just a quick word on the process to get the most out. You do have instant messaging capabilities. So if you have a question during this presentation, feel free to post it and we'll try to address it in real time. But we will also have a Q&A session at the conclusion of the webinar. And if you would like a copy of this presentation or other materials we refer to, by all means, just let us know. You can do that via the GoToWebinar link. You could do that through the invitation that you received. Give us a call, but by all means, if you're interested in our materials, just let us know. Okay, the purpose of today's webinar, I'd really like you to focus on two things. You know, we talk about this five-step process. So the first thing I'd like you to really take away or have as a takeaway is just understanding the process, right? Looking at the implementation of ERM as a process and how that process flows. The second thing I'd like you to focus on in this session is outputs, right? When you think about enterprise risk management, a lot of it it's not just about forward-looking ability to assess and monitor risk, but it's really about creating outputs that are the foundation of forming good risk-based decisions. So those two things I'd like you to kind of keep an eye on is how ERM flows as a process and how it creates outputs for better decision making. I can tell you we could easily spend the entire webinar on either of these areas, and I would certainly invite you to talk to about it, but this is a primer, so we will move with some pace. The only other comment I would like to make is ERM, though the process is the process, based on the scope, magnitude, and complexity of your bank, ERM is dynamic and based on your risk appetite and other factors, tends to shape and mold how that process serves the bank. I want you to keep an eye out for that as well. Oops. And so the things we're going to cover today is we're going to briefly talk about what it is. I'm assuming most of you know what it is, but we'll talk on that briefly. Why enterprise risk management, an overview of the model, and then we'll spend the bulk of our time on this implementation process, right? How we move through those 5 steps. So as far as ERM itself, ERM is really rooted in an organization called COSO, which stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. And back in 2004, they came up with what they defined as enterprise risk management framework or model. Since then, they've met again in 2017, and it's evolved. Initially, it was very process-oriented. It did tie into kind of this top-down approach. It was a process. It was strategic. It focused on risk appetite, and it was a process of achieving certain outcomes. They've really evolved it more to be more dynamic and recognizing the role of people in process. So their definition today of enterprise risk management, or as of 2017, is enterprise risk management includes the culture, capabilities, and practices integrated with strategy setting and performance that organizations rely on to manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value. The big leap of faith, or I think the big movement that they realized from 2004 to today, is ERM's it's really all about, creating sustainable value. And I think that's what their definition really is brought to mind. We're going to look at ERM today from a top-down perspective. And for those of you who are a little bit familiar with ERM, it can come in a top-down form or a bottoms-up. Top-down tends to serve senior management and the board a little more effectively, right? It's very strategic in nature. It's really tied to optimizing performance. And so a top-down system is really designed to enable top management to make better risk-based decisions. That's what it is. And you can see the definitions. It's about analyzing risk associated with earnings, capital, and franchise value. It's about understanding where those top risks reside and ensure that mitigants are in place or capabilities are in place to serve the purpose, right? Optimizing capital, franchise value. Bottoms up is more detailed. It can be more granular. It can be more enterprise-wide. And it really gets into accountability at the delivery level. Both systems are enterprise risk management. Both systems serve a purpose. To the purpose of today's session, though, we will be talking about a top-down approach. And when you think about it from a top-down approach, it really is about the optimization or maximizing earnings, capital, and franchise value. So when you're looking at ERM and asking the question, what does it need to do in order to serve that purpose, you really want to ask the question. I've got a little, I see. Excuse me, I just had a little notice. Great. It is about serving certain purposes, right? So an effective top-down ERM system should actually support your ability to achieve strategic goals. It should tie back to your performance. It should enhance or improve the quality of your institutional decision-making. It should elevate the level of risk awareness. Back in the day, as bankers, we were always credit risk aware. And today, it's really more about being risk aware. And when we think of things like cyber risk and operational risk and all those other factors, it's a much broader context. And your ERM system should provide support for that. If a good ERM system is working, it should either reduce or start preventing operational surprises or loss. It's about the anticipation or the forward-looking or the analysis of understanding where risk resides and what we're doing to control it. An effective ERM system should position or prepare your organization well to seize opportunities that are consistent with your risk appetite or consistent with the level of risk you're willing to take. And if it's working and firing on all cylinders, it should optimize the deployment of capital, and it should break down functional silos that may exist between departments or among departments. Because when you really think about it, ERM should be breaking down those functional silos to enhance the cross-communication across the enterprise. The big thing I want you to think about at this stage as we start moving into the process itself is remember that enterprise risk management is not about risk avoidance, right? It's really about right-sizing your capabilities and your controls to meet the demands or to support your risk appetite, right? And so risk management is not suggesting that you're going to reduce the level of risk you're going to take. What you're going to do is you're going to put the appropriate controls in place to make those risk levels acceptable in developing sustainable value. Okay? So I talked about a 5-step process. So here they are. And this is that first point I wanted you to focus on is it is a process. And so when you think about it in terms of primer, we're going to just touch on each of these. But if you think about enterprise risk management as a process, a top-down process starts with governance. So our step one is governance. Now, when you're evaluating your own ERM process or you're evaluating a vendor or taking a look at ERM from a process standpoint, you want to make sure it does 4 things, right? And as you look at it, you want it to demonstrate how it identifies, measures, monitors, and controls risk. If you can't clearly take a look at that process and say, yep, that's how I identify risk, and yep, that's how I measure it, this is my monitoring systems, and this is how I use that monitoring system to control risk, then it's not fulfilling its purpose, right? And what I'd like to do is briefly touch on each of these steps as we go through the balance of our time together. So let's think about it from a flowchart standpoint. And so again, if you think about ERM, whether you're using a technology platform or a process that's manual or even a bunch of Excel spreadsheets, it still follows a flow, right? So when you look at those green boxes on the left, that's kind of what top down does. That says I'm taking governance, my strategic plan, my capital plan, and I'm taking all these factors up front and I'm developing my risk appetite, and then I'm moving out, because if I do that effectively on the front end, then how I measure or how I identify, measure, monitor, and control my risk will be calibrated or aligned with my risk, right? If you're a small family-owned bank that's been serving the same customers for 50 years in a certain ag belt, and you understand the ag industry, ERM is going to serve a purpose for you, and it's going to be aligned with what your risk appetite is, and you're going to go through the same 4 steps of identifying, measuring, monitoring, and controlling risk. But you may have an ERM system that looks differently from a bank that might be in heavy acquisition mode, or has a payment system, or has trust services, insurance, and mortgage, and multiple lines of risk, where their ERM system has to reflect the scope, the complexity, the magnitude of their organization, right? So this just kind of gives you that sense of flow. Identifying is really about your risk assessment. We'll talk about that in just a second. But it's how you look at inherent risk, adequacy of risk management, residual risk, direction, what areas you assess. And primarily it's going to be risk categories, right? Like credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity, price, operational risk, strategic risk, reputation risk. But it can also be by department or strategic business units like insurance or payment systems, trust services, things of that nature, wealth management. Measurement in our world is all about identifying those greater risk and conducting further analysis. And that further analysis gives us a sense of what's the likelihood of this risk occurring. If it were to occur, how severe would it be? What's it look like inherently versus applying my controls against it? And if there's residual risk in these top risks, do I have an appropriate risk mitigation plan to further control that risk? And then I move into monitoring who gets what and when, and controls are how do they use the information, right? So think about it as a process and a flow, a continuous loop that you just get better over time, right? But if you think about it as a project manager, and I know we have some CROs on this call and some other project managers, think of it as outputs, right? So we talked about it as process, and now we're putting on our project management hat, and we're saying, what are the outputs? What are the deliverables I need to do in each of these 5 steps? So in governance, I need to assemble my team. I need to have my data in place. I need to have a framework for my ERM process. I need to take my team through an orientation. I need to set up my risk appetite and my risk appetite statements and my KRIs. I need to have policies and charters in place. You can have 2 charters. You can have one at the board level. You can have one at management level. And I have got a policy that dictates how ERM serves my bank, right? And the next step, if you think about, the identification or the assessment process, this is, do I have a framework in place? Do I have a means to capture quantitative and qualitative data by either risk category or risk area, conduct the risk with participants, and have it rolled up in some process that gives me a sense of what my risk appetite, my risk profile is, meaning my risk profile being my inherent risk, my adequacy of risk management, my aggregate risk or residual risk, and direction of risk, right? So, and as I move through the process, my next output in measurement is quantifying those top risks, ranking them, analyzing them, and if necessary, developing a risk mitigation plan if the residual risk is unacceptable, right, to further control the risk. So outputs, again, your monitoring system is your dashboard, right? So it's what do I develop over what period of time, and what needs to be seen, and what's my lens. So that's your monitoring mechanism. So if you're looking at things like heat maps and trend charts or risk assessment results and people's inputs, how does that framed? How do I set up that monitoring system? And then once I set it up, controlling is about who gets what, right? What's my board need? What's my management team need? What's my committee need? And what's the role of ERM to get them the information they need to make appropriate decisions as it relates to risk and risk control. So let's break it down and take a look at the 5 key components. And what I'm going to try to do here is, and again, this is a primer, so this may not be an absolute how-to, but it's going to give you a sense of what you're going to be doing in each of these steps, and how you can work with your management teams or your boards in terms of supporting the process. So when you think of governance, And I mentioned you pull in your strategic plan, capital plan, but your outputs are your risk appetite framework and your policies. That's what you want to get to, right? So if you think about your risk appetite framework, it's nothing more than a heat map. And you can create categories by department. This example shows you a heat map by risk area, credit risk, interest rate risk. And you're using a 5-point scale is my risk appetite. And risk appetite is nothing more than the risk you're willing to take to make money, right? What am I willing to do or not do to create value? And so if I've got moderate level of risk, what's that look like? If I have moderate to high level of risk, so if you use credit as an example and you're saying, well, how do I determine what my risk profile or my risk appetite is? Well, a lot of it has to do with complexity and other factors, right? So if I want above average growth by its definition is taking on more risk. If I'm a big commercial real estate lender and I'm going to run elevated CRE concentrations, that's a risk consideration. That must mean I'm taking on additional risk. If I want to maximize my profitability and make every dollar I can, and so I'm going to control my credit quality better, but I may not have as much in reserve, so I'm going to run my ALLL a little leaner. That means I'm taking on additional risk. All those factors determine what your risk appetite is. And you can apply that in terms of liquidity risk, in terms of, your loan to deposit ratio, operational risk, in terms of how much you're growing commercially, how many branches you have, how many people you have, how much technology you're leveraging, things of that nature. So you want to ask yourself the question, what am I willing to do or not do to reach my business goals, to create value? So once you set up your risk appetite framework, you want to develop some risk appetite statements to further define what you mean. And that could be 2 to 3 sentences for each. And then finally, as far as risk appetite goes, you want to create key risk indicators. And what this grid in the center is showing you is key risk indicators with a range, right? So if I'm talking about credit risk or interest rate risk or compliance risk or whatever category I'm looking at, what's low risk look like and what's high risk look like and what's it look like in between, so I can actually quantify when I talk about my risk appetite, I can actually quantify where I set on my risk continuum, be it low to high. So if you think of risk appetite, think about it in those 3 things, right? Heat map, statements, key risk indicators. And then the final thing about governance is, what's my policy at the bank level or at the holding company level? And do I have an ERM committee at the board level? Is it embedded in audit committee, for example? Do I have a senior team at management level? And do my committees have charters? So in this first step of governance, you want to walk away with committee structure, your risk appetite heat map, statements, KRIs, and your draft charter and policy documents. Now, when you move into the assessments, which is step 2 in the process, you want to think a little bit more about what's my framework. So just very quickly, OCC's got a framework, right? If you're an OCC bank on this call, they've got 8 key risk categories, and they use terms like quantity of risk, quality of risk, aggregate, and direction. If you're an FRB bank, quantity of risk is inherent risk, quality of risk is adequacy of risk management, aggregates composite, and direction is trend. So the point is here, and you might want to use camels. All I'm saying in step 1, before you go into the assessment itself, is create a framework, right? That's what you're going to do, step 1 in implementing an ERM system. Create a framework or a lens to view risk through. Once you've done that, you conduct the risk assessment. And I know this is just a busy slide. The key takeaways here is every area you're going to assess has criteria. And if you guys want a copy of this grid, just shoot me a note, say, Jeff, send me the checklist for an ERM assessment. What this grid simply does, by risk category, credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk, price, operational, and so forth, is says what you need to look at to conduct a risk assessment effectively. And I got a quick question there about any tips on how a range should be configured for each KRI, historical data versus peer data. What data requirements? So the quick question is there, and I'll answer it quickly, is when you're thinking of KRIs, your key risk indicators, and you're trying to figure out what's low to high, first of all, go to policy areas first and see if you have some policies, regulatory guidance, canary reports. But your own history is useful, but it's myopic, right? It's an internal view. If you're trying to establish parameters of risk, I always look for guidance or regulatory guidance or best practice data first, but you really can't beat peer analysis data. And if I have a minute, I'll show you guys what that looks like. But by all means, I would say history is good for the bank, but it's not necessarily indicative of what the right KRI should be. Performance could be deceptive, so you need comparative analysis. So in the risk assessment section, figure out what you need to ask first for every area. Some of it's going to be qualitative, right? It's going to be the inputs of your team members. Some of it's going to be quantitative. One thing to remember with ERM, it's all about forward looking. It's about anticipating where risk is going. So you just don't get to look in your rearview mirror. So if you're looking at strategic risk, are you looking at economic trends? Are you looking at psychodemographic trends? If the markets you serve are growing at a rate of 1 to 2%, and you want to grow at a rate of 5 to 10, you're going to need to take on more risk to achieve that growth. And your ERM system should help you articulate that. But so the big takeaway is come up with your list of what you're going to assess by category, by risk area. Understand that you're going to get inputs, both qualitative and quantitative. Try to develop a discipline and assign risk owners by category so you're nurturing involvement. And then try to summarize your data in some form of report. And I'm going to show you a quick one here. I'm going to power through it. But this is just a risk assessment of credit risk, right? Here's a definition, interagency definition of credit risk. Here's my risk profile. What's my inherent risk? What's my adequacy of risk management? What's my direction or composite or residual? What's my direction? And then what are my key findings that are favorable, that support my observations on control? And then this is key. What are either the unfavorable or emerging risks that I've identified in my process? So you've kind of created this executive summary, right, of what's favorable, what controls my risk, or where is my risk likely to be moving, or what's happening that's going to change the world as we know it. And then support it with all of your background or your audit trail data. Okay? Oops. There we go. And that's the risk assessment process. This little thing in the background is just looking at all the risk categories and try to find something that can help you indicate trends, right? Because ultimately ERM serves you better over time. Here's kind of a key one that is what we talk about is the third step is measuring or prioritizing top risk. Very simply stated, it's some risks are just more dangerous than others. And it could have to do with liquidity in terms of funding your growth. If you're running 100% loan to deposit ratio and you can't drive enough core deposits to fund that growth and your CEO wants to keep growing, that's a risk. And that's a top risk. So the whole thing about measuring and prioritizing top risk is come up with what that list is. What are those top risks? Once you've identified them and described them, create a scorecard among your senior team or your team, your risk committee team, to force rank them. Once you force rank them, analyze them, define them, determine what the likelihood and severity of that risk would be to occur, measure the inherent risk aspects of that risk. Where does it reside? What do my current controls look like? Measure those controls. If there is residual risk, what do I need to do to narrow that gap, to control that risk, and move that data into a risk mitigation plan? So again, prioritize, assess, and mitigate. That's what you do in a measurement phase. As far as monitoring, simply stated, what do I need to look at and when? Try to keep it simple, right? Try to find those KRIs. You can't put all of the data up into a summary report. You need to look for KRIs that give you a sense of trend, give you a sense of where am I within my risk tolerance levels. And if it's trending in a certain direction, then what do I need to go look at to maybe further explore that? From a risk reporting standpoint, I'll just say less is more. Those of you that have ERM systems today and you're trying to find a way to report to senior management, you just can't, deal with every line item. You have to identify those components that indicate what your distance is from achieving that sustainable value creation or how risk might play into it. So your challenge is, if you're in charge of BSA and BSA is a hot button for your bank, how do I summarize that information regarding BSA? Or is it fair lending because I'm in mortgage? Or is it, key considerations under wealth management? Those are, strategic risk like ROI, ROE, net interest margin, operating efficiency. Those are no-brainers, and they need to be in the report as well. It's finding the nuance associated with business activities like exceptions or variances that lead you to further discover. But your monitoring system has to dial that in. And then you have to move into step 5 saying, who sees what and when, and how do I provide them with better information to make risk-based decisions that focus on outputs, right? That focus on our performance. And so if you think about it, this is kind of the money shot, right? The board needs high-level stuff that really gives them a sense of providing good governance and leadership for the organization. So what are our top risks? What's emerging? What's on the horizon there? How are we doing against our key risk indicators? Should I be more informed with current market outlook? It's not just a budgeting exercise. It's really about understanding the nature of risk and if it's in the way of us getting where we want to go. And remember, most directors are worried about earnings per share, ROA, ROE, and kind of have a tough time worrying about compliance issues, but so be it. Board management wants a deeper dive, right? Analysis by risk area, key action plans against risk controls, better understanding if we're moving in a certain direction, be it cyber risk related, compliance risk related, things of that nature. But management needs a little thicker book. And then if you're on the committee, you own it, right? You're the deep data dive. And you need chapter and verse of risk categories, risk assessment data, risk tracking data. And that's really key, is that you have a system that routinely provides good feedback over time. ERM just gets better over time. And as you dial it in, you want to keep looking forward, right? It's all about looking forward. So I know that was kind of a rocket ship through our 5 steps, but it's really important to bring it back to those 2 points I started with. When you think about implementing ERM, there's 2 things. It can be very complex if you don't have a good process. So you need to understand the navigation. You need to understand the roadmap. And secondly, it's if you don't have good outputs, if you don't have good data outputs that form good decision, that's another fatal flaw. So your 2 issues, right? Good process, how it flows, good outputs. So so just my closing thoughts, break down your ERM process into modules. Now, I'll take you through our 5 here. Think in terms of inputs and outputs, right? Outputs should be designed as a basis for decision or discovery. And ensure that you're involving people from across the enterprise, right? It's a collaborative exercise. It can't be done just off a system. But when you look at if you break it down into modules, look at our 5 steps. Step 1, governance. What did I get out of it? I've got committee structure. I've got roles and responsibilities. I've got risk appetite. I've got my risk appetite statements, my KRIs, my policy. Those are outputs. Under identifying risk, I've got my enterprise risk assessment system in place, and it's rolling up into a risk profile. Those are outputs, right? My measurement system says, where does the greatest risk reside? And what am I doing to control it? Those are outputs. My monitoring system says, this is what I need to look at over this period of time and by this area, right? It's your dashboard. It's the lenses you create to track and monitor your risk so that you can move into step 5 and provide decision makers with the best outputs, right? Those outputs that can help drive their business decisions. And I think you'll discover that an effective ERM process, it's really interesting. It can align and synchronize both risk management and performance priorities. And many times you've got a CRO kind of running risk and dealing with compliance stuff, and you've got your CFO maybe focusing on business performance. A good ERM system integrates and synchronizes both performance and risk management priorities. That's when you know you've got kind of the secret sauce or kismet. So, in closing, before we go to questions and answers, I hope you found those 5 steps useful. If you would like this presentation, by all means, shoot us a note, give us a call. We'll get it off to you. At least it's a good walk through the process. Just a quick word about us again is we are all about ensuring our community bank clients' business and risk priorities are in sync, right? That if you're in risk management, we're going to help the risk management person synchronize what they're doing with the finance guys and vice versa. And we accomplish this by seamlessly integrating strategy, capital, and ERM inputs, throughputs, and outputs to create better decisions and better performance. So our product selection is we have a full implementation suite. We have modular solutions for ERM. We have quarterly tracking and reportings to track and measure ERM. And we now have enterprise risk management and audit schedule. So with that, I think I will open it up. If any of you would like to submit a question in writing or through the instant messenger, I'd be happy to respond. And one's coming through, and one just evaluating adopting ERM at our bank. How long does it take, or how long does implementation take? Great question. Think about those modules again. So if you think about you need to do governance or risk appetite, risk assessment, top risk analysis, those are the three big chunks of time. I've seen it done in as brief a period of time as 2 to 3 weeks. To be honest with you, it's more of a 3 to 6 month process to get your system in place and implemented. If somebody tells you they can do it faster than that, it's great. It will come down to the level of resources you're willing to put against it. So I hope that answers it. But probably, assume it's going to be a quarter's worth of time at least. Okay. Well, I hope everyone found this session valuable and got a little bit of insight into an effective ERM process. Again, my name is Jeff Rigsby. If you have any questions or would like a copy of the presentation or learn more about our solutions, please feel free to get a hold of me, or you can contact Robert Finch, who is our recently appointed Senior Vice President and Director of Sales and Marketing, and Robert would be happy to get back to you as well. Thank you all, and enjoy your holiday season.